All right. This is the part of the day which consists of me turning things over to my best friends. So I would like you to join me in welcoming Edna Ishayik, my co-conspirator on many things, and her all-star team here, who I think are going to introduce themselves. And this is framework number 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for hosting this day and for inviting us to be part of this. Before we do anything, I'm just going to ask our fishbowl, that's what we're calling this. Doesn't look like a fishbowl, but our panelists to just introduce themselves with just name, title, organization, and research area. And,
Great. My name is Janet Tran, and I work with the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation Institute. I'm the Director of Learning and Leadership there, and I think that was it, correct?
Yep.
I'm Tony Earls. I'm a professor emeritus at Harvard Medical School and Harvard School of Public Health. My interests are in youth participation and collective advocacy of neighborhoods.
We have microphones. Okay, stick with our own. My name is Lou Freedland. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I direct the Center for Communication Democracy, do work on civic communication, public life.
Carmen Sirianni, teach sociology and public policy at Brandeis, and also work at the Ash Center, the Kennedy School of Government, and I've written on civic innovation, youth engagement, collaborative governance, these kinds of things over the last 2 decades or so.
Hi everyone, I'm Kei Kawashima-Ginsberg. I'm Director of Circle at Tisch College. Our study area will be youth civic learning and engagement.
Hello, I'm Jeff Coates. I'm Director of Research and Evaluation at the National Conference on Citizenship, and our focus is civic health, and we do a civic health index with states and communities, and our mission is strengthen civic health.
Thank you. A tremendous thanks to this group. Several of you have flown in to be here for this, so we're grateful. Janet had her luggage lost. We had major struggles to get over to be here, so I'm very, very grateful to have your expertise on this. Just a quick thing about Civic Nation, a new organization just under 2 years old, based in DC. We use data organizing and public relations, and we tackle a really wide range of issues. We have a campaign that seeks to end sexual assault, one that seeks to make community colleges free. I won't rattle them off. You could go to our website. There's 9 of them, and we have a particular approach to engaging people on these issues. About a year ago, we decided to take on civic engagement. I'll tell you if you want to hear offline our struggles of even trying to figure out what that meant. And now, a year later, we have 4 projects under that heading. 2 focus on voter participation, 1 focuses on K through 12 civic learning, and the 4th you'll hear a little bit about today. Because when we looked at we got kind of some frame of reference on the voting front, and we recognized that civic learning for young people is really important. And then we were sort of looking at the everything else of civic engagement and puzzling as to what to do. It really wasn't clear immediately to us what was needed. So we cracked open the books, we started to study up. We looked at over 125 research pieces, analyses, data sets, writings, and distilled all of that down to create a framework for one, not but just one approach to civic engagement. That tally of research pieces is ticking up, and if you have any you would like to add and make sure that we calculate into our synthesis, please send them our way through the Google Doc. So we synthesized these pieces of research. The full presentation is 92 slides. I promise there are not 92 slides behind this. There are much fewer. And I want to note that the panelists that you see here are represented in the research that we've synthesized. And so we have them here kind of in person to reflect both on their own work, interact with one another, and to what we've put together here. And you all, just by being in this room, have become part of this synthesis, because when you raise questions and ideas, we will fold it all as much as we can back into the final draft. So what you're seeing here, for the first time, no one beyond our advisory committee has seen this before, so another premiere today. You'll be part of what the final draft looks like. So we encourage you, which is why we were hoping people can sit close so we can make this a conversation, and you could help to build on what we've done so far. So first, some important thank yous. I promise I won't take up too much time, but we absolutely want to thank the Rita Allen Foundation and the Joyce Foundation, who have allowed us to tackle this issue in such a free-ranging, organic way that I feel very privileged to have had, and very few people do, so I'm grateful. We would definitely not be here without Peter, absolutely not, and we work with a pro bono creative firm called Co-Collective. They usually work with organizations like Google, Microsoft, Nike, Starbucks, Macy's, but instead they're working with us for free, so we're very grateful to them as well. We have this amazing advisory committee. I won't go through all of them, but it's a mix of academics, practitioners, tech folks, and marketing folks. Now to the meat of the matter. What is our vision? Together we have put together this very broad, very high-level vision statement. We want to foster inclusive and sustained engagement at the local level. And the reason we chose these things is because we know through the work of the National Conference on Citizenship that even when we hold constant factors like race and income, we still see that engaged communities are better off. They are. They are more prosperous, they are healthier, they are safer, and they are more resilient. I'm not going to dig into these here because we'll do it in conversation and we'll respond to your questions, but that's data that we have and stuff that we know. There are also risks to disengaged communities. We know this from research as well. We see that weak engagement at the local level creates problems for individuals. We heard last night about loneliness and isolation and the effects that can have on the individual. In communities where distrust in institutions is high, it's hard to function economically and civically. And then the winner for scariest quote in this whole deck comes from Janet Tran, which is that when you don't have trust in institutions, we lose our grip on democracy. Not good. So what we posit and are open to challenge and suggestion is that by increasing sustained local participation for the long term, communities can start to set all those factors into balance and can be healthier amongst themselves and also bubble up to a healthy democracy. So that's all well and good, and you're probably thinking that's great. So what the heck do we do? We don't know. We hope you know. So this session is very much, whatever strategists call it now, blue sky, whiteboard, all of those things, very open. This is totally a work in progress, as you can see. So eager to hear what you think. And before we give just the simple framework that we are using, or positing at least, before I do that, I just want to say that the term civic engagement, we take a extremely broad definition. Almost anything really could be considered civic engagement. It can happen in many modes, in many manifestations. There's many levers you could pull. It's all correct. It's all, solves certain problems, and it's all valid. We're not trying to say none of it is, this is civic engagement and this is not. So I just want to make that very clear. But we do believe that at the local level, if what you want is a certain type of, a community that is inclusively and in a sustained way engaged, we do think that there are three essences of pieces that you do need to see. And again, we posit this as a question to you and not a final answer, but what we believe, and this is also, I should say, very much based on Peter's research and analysis, but the three pieces to us are And again, these are broad headings. I won't try to get into every single one of these. We'll just open it up for conversation. But deliberation, there's tons of research about the beneficial effects, both on individuals, civic life, and communities when deliberation is part of the environment. And I just do want to state that under this heading is inclusiveness. There are studies, including one by Samuel Somers, who's actually here at Tufts, that shows that if you gather a more racially diverse group, they will appraise evidence more accurately, and that whites within that group will more carefully consider the evidence. And there's a few other pieces of research that we've used to kind of come to these conclusions, but inclusiveness falls under this heading. If it's not inclusive and wide ranges of perspectives are not included, then this just is the same as what you have now, and it doesn't change the dynamic. So that's important to note. A couple other themes within this are responsiveness and accountability of governments. Human-centered design falls under this category. I won't go through the whole list, but it kind of gives you a sense of what we're thinking of there. The next piece is collaborative work. Obviously, it can't just be talk for things to change. We're looking at themes like collective efficacy, which I'm hoping we'll hear about today because it's an area of study of one of our panelists, and other themes under this heading that sort of contribute to that. And then the third is relationships. We know from way back in Bowling Alone that, and as well as work that NCOC has done, a lot of good comes out of these sort of loose tie associations and social networks. We can't just have that. We need all three of these together, we think. So if you just have relationships, but you don't have this other stuff, then it kind of doesn't work. But you know, a lot of times the social stuff can get left out, even though it's crucially important, we think. So these things play off each other. It looks different in different contexts, but, you know, and different places have different levels of each, and, you know, taking all of that into account, you know, we question, you know, we're positing the question, are these three things elements that do seem like essential pieces of what you want at the local level to foster engagement? So part of the challenge is that in the next section, we'll discuss sort of the how do we operationalize this? What are the indicators? You know, how do we know if we're doing this at the right levels? But let's pause and just talk about these three things, knowing there's obviously a lot more we could say, but being more interested in what your immediate reactions are, you know, than that. So let's kick things off with just a couple of questions. And this is for you guys and the panelists, whoever wants to jump in first. And the first question is just what are the strengths and the weaknesses of this as a framework? Does this combination of elements work to, you know, in your view, and what would need to be clarified before you could even sort of make a judgment? So I throw that open to the panel up front, but also the audience as well. Awkward silence.
I'll start.
Oh, good.
Because I'm a neighborhood researcher, I think it's important to reveal the limitation in the work that we've done on neighborhoods. And that's been defining what a community is and what is local and what's beyond the reach of local in terms of different kinds of resources and opportunities that people have in communities. We've used census tracts as a proxy for neighborhoods. And we have a good sense that it's a good approximation, but it's not geopolitically defined. And so one of the questions I have about, you know, studies of and efforts to mobilize civic engagement is how wide agreement there is that the turf defined as a community is validly and politically, you know, in the reach of the people who live there. Is it local? I might say we solved this problem in an experiment we did in Tanzania, which has a very decentralized government such that every 2,000 households has a set of elected representatives. And so in a city of 150,000 people, 160,000 people in Moshi, Tanzania, on the slopes of Kilimanjaro, we're able to do a randomized experiment in which these units, these 2,000 household units, were randomized into a control and an experimental group, and then the control group became the waiting group to see whether or not the effect took place in the experimental group. And it did, and so what happened is that the 15 control groups joined the 15 experimental groups at the end to carry out health surveys in the city. So geopolitically defined units turned out to be very important because they absorbed the legitimacy and the results that the young citizens did in their work. So there was a connection between a scientific project that was rigorously designed and the community and the government of the community that was ready to receive the results of it and use that as a platform for sustaining the organization beyond the research project.
So can I offer something on the other pole without at all denying, because I have looked at neighborhoods and neighborhood associations, which is in the world we live in today, we must, one problem area or one way of framing, to go back to Joe's and Donata's presentation and others today, is that we have to think about cities, large and small, some very big, and metropolitan areas, but I'll leave that aside, as what will it take to make them sustainable and resilient as cities, especially, but not only in the face of climate changes, but with all the inequalities that get reproduced through land use processes and segregation and many other things. And what I would say about your framework, which I like a lot, that you have the three pieces, is that the more complex that you get, so when you're thinking about sustainable and resilient cities, you're thinking about environmental justice, you're thinking about climate adaptation, you're thinking about healthy community, and different groups use different frames that overlap. You're thinking about green buildings. You're thinking about, there are many networks that are both civic networks and professional networks and institutional actors, and including market actors. So that the more you have of that, the more, I would just put out, nimble you have to be in figuring out how to utilize different components of this in different contexts. Some are going to be intensely relational and trust building, but not only at the neighborhood level, maybe with, the planner in the office, that if you don't break through to that planner, you're never going to get the bicycle plan and all of that stuff working, et cetera. So I think the more complex policy and institutional arena, the more nimble and the richer that this framework, is.
Through problem solving, you do build empathy and trust, which are what is necessary to build those relationships in the long term. I think, as Edna said, these three things need to happen in the group at different times. They're not all, I don't think, I think there's intensity of them at different times as well. I don't think all three of them could happen at the same time with the same intensity. It's just not feasible, to tell you the truth. So,
how is the urban-rural divide addressed in this framework? If people, I live in Oregon, where we have political interdependence for a state, but not necessarily community interdependence. So how does this framework, how can this framework be adapted to increase those ties among people who live in totally different lives?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have a great answer except that that's sort of the idea. Can you do a generic version of this as a playbook that works, then specifically in one context differently than it does in another? Do you need to adjust the levels, on the way in of what, you need to start out in, community A that you do in community B, but the idea is to make it flexible enough that people can understand or just, take it upon themselves to sort of figure out where to begin, and just leave enough room so that it can adapt to that, unless you think in certain places these three things wouldn't work at all, which I'd be open to to hearing that too.
I find it really fascinating that we've already talked quite a bit about location or geography. And I'm an anthropologist by trade, and in anthropology, just by the last 20, 30 years, that's when they started actually anthropologists thinking about what does geography mean to identity, self-identity. That's relatively new for social science, especially in certain fields. I mean, and I think we need to take that into account. That's such a huge thing, is who you are really does, and how you interact with people.
Johnson, and I'm actually part of a large study of what we call, in our normal academically pretentious way, the political communication ecology of the entire state. And a few of you may know Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment. Kathy's part of this research group. And so I think that this speaks to a problem in this framework, not so much with the individual bucket, but the difficulty of making what I think is, to be blunt, perhaps an idealistic or an abstract assumption that there can be all these different kinds of deliberative dialogue, collaborative work across boundaries without specifying the networks of those boundaries and the scale of those boundaries. So the chances of people in Viroqua, Wisconsin, having a dialogue with people in Milwaukee, I mean, yes, you could do a James Fishkin type thing and get them all in one place. They could talk to each other. There might be some virtuous results of that, but that would not generate collaborative work statewide. It wouldn't actually, I think, based upon research that I've done and Kathy herself has done, that would not create the kind of cross-cutting dialogue that might be necessary and also extremely difficult, because there are local identities across which people, as you know, Joe certainly, I don't know if he's here, but the people don't like each other across those divides. They don't want relationships. They are relatively ensconced in relatively homophilous or self-similar networks, and that is actually part of the base of the problem. And so I think I would argue that it's time or important in thinking about these possibilities to have an element of what I would call sociological realism, and to begin to say, let's look at actually the kinds of networks where people are, the actual possibilities of their engaging with each other, how cross-cutting identities might or might not encounter each other, and what happens when they do. Because I feel like I've been involved in these kinds of discussions for at least 20 or more years. And these relationships, some version of them I've seen, to be honest, for 20 years or more. Ever since Putnam, at least, we've seen some variant of them. And I think if we don't have that heavy dose of realism, we're not going to actually move beyond essentially rearranging categories and replugging things in. And I'd like to see us, and I think Joe's presentation, the one we just saw, shows that there's urgency here to not indulge, I don't mean to be rude, but to not indulge our own best fantasies or most idealistic sense of what might be done.
Facebook as a country, right? Or whatever that means, but this idea of how you're breaking down borders.
Well,
When you think about technology and the implications of technology, so if there's people out there who say Facebook is becoming a country.
Sorry, I'm just repeating what you said, that Facebook is a country and the applications of technology.
How technology is maybe changing what, to your point, what is local.
I just want to, and I'll be quiet then, but there's three categories, I think, when we think about this problem. One is locality and community. One are social networks, which are not the same as online networks, and the other are online networks, and they're very different. They overlap and they influence each other in very different ways. So Facebook really isn't a nation. Facebook is a set of clusters of highly homophilous, self-similar groups of people who mostly talk to people like themselves. And it appears to be a nation, if you live within it, everyone's against, Scott Walker in my state, or everyone is, I hear this all the time living in Madison. Well, of course, it's not true at all. But we all believe that the whole world thinks the way that we do because of those homophily over assumptions, overstatements.
I want to jump in really quickly to say I think the physical neighborhoods are starting to resemble that, though, because of the way we choose to live where we live, essentially based on our market preferences, right? And based on school districts, our values. So when I hear that the civic relationship needs to be revised to be trusting relationship, I really do kind of question whether that's really the right way to go about that. I'm not saying we shouldn't trust each other, but I'm not sure if the productive civic relationship needs to always include trust. Because if we really actually have diverse democracy, we can't like each other and we can't trust each other. But we do need to share commitment to be able to do the work. But I don't think that necessarily has to involve like. So.
Can I comment on that for just a second? In our work on collective efficacy, we started the analysis with two factors. One was social cohesion, which included a variable of trust. And the other was informal social control, which was a willingness to interact and to act in concordance with other people in the community. And it turns out that in the analysis we did, the social cohesion component of collective efficacy is very weak. It doesn't predict. It's not until you measure accurately the informal social control element that you get an effect on violence rates and birth weight and asthma and the various other outcomes that we looked at. So
can you just go the next step with that? I didn't get it.
well, that the extent to which people know each other and exchange resources, so trust and reciprocal exchange, are not the major components of the variable called collective efficacy, which consists of those two variables. But in addition to that, the belief that your neighbors will take action, that if the city says we're going to close a fire station in your neighborhood, that you believe that the citizens or residents will rally. If a child is walking across the street by himself, you believe people will intervene and help that. If they're starting a fight in front of your house, would you do anything about it? Do you think people around here care about and are activated and so forth? So this active agency aspect of collective efficacy is really the key mechanism. That's the ingredient that counts. So if you're doing an intervention, you want to boost that propensity to be an actor.
Thank you. I noticed that the words health or healthier were mentioned 3 times in your introductory remarks. So my question is, if you could refine how you define health. Is it well-being? I treat sick people. It means something very different than what people on the other end of the spectrum think about as health outcomes measurements. And the reason I'm asking this is how you define it will impact each of these 3 distinct areas, and do you think of applying them across these three areas, and if so, how?
This will probably be unsatisfying, but we're very issue agnostic and wouldn't even try to define that because it would look so different in different places. And so the idea is, can you give a framework vast enough but focused enough that people could decide for themselves in each community what it is and what that means or what the key issues are. And so, so unfortunately I cannot. And I don't know, but maybe we should think about refining that, but is it too wide a range for us to be able to sort of want to decide, or create a list? Maybe we could do that. But I'm really open to the suggestion. We just haven't for that reason. I'll let you say.
Oh, here, no, go.
It'll probably go.
Yeah, I wanted to follow in on this this third piece up here and the sociological realism part. So, you know, Putnam talks about the bonding social capital as opposed to the bridging social capital. And I think that the bridging part is really, really important here if you can do it. That the relationships do, in a sense, have to cross some of the traditional divides. But I wouldn't want to then at that point, you know, throw my hands up and say, well, it's hopeless because we're geographically separated or something like this. And I think of the example, I don't know how it evolved after this, but the example of Uniontown, Alabama, where these, you know, people who were very diverse got together, and, you know, racial segregation had been the norm in that community for a long time. And they got together to discuss how to revitalize their local economy and revitalize and beautify the town and so forth. And they found they had a surprising degree of ability to build this bridging social capital just by, you know, working together. So the initial tense formality eventually evolved into very warm relationships that, you know, crossed racial lines.
Just pass it back.
I'm very curious about thinking of this almost as like a logic model. And when I read these three examples that are the building blocks of civic participation, they are also examples of civic participation. So there's a tautology here. And they're coming from a place where they are known to correlate with these broad set of outcomes of civic participation, but they don't necessarily correlate with giving people power. And so I want to have an understanding of, are you trying to give people power? Are you trying to kind of go after this kind of nebulous set of things that correlate with these civic participation outcomes that we've traditionally studied?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I agree with these three and the comments. I'm wondering where quality information is, media, journalism. I mean, to have deliberative discourse and to really work together, don't you need information, timely and quality information as well?
We would put that. I would put that in the first bucket, just as inherent to having, as you just said, sort of you need that to have the discourse, but it's also creating better sources of information is sort of.
So you would put like newspapers and journalism and deliberative discourse?
Exactly. Yeah.
And this is something definitely the working group approached as a whole, as, you know, fake news and the ability to have agreed and shared facts was definitely on the forefront of our minds. But I actually think it would be iterative across all three categories, that we are collaborating together to make sure that we have accurate information, that we have the relationships to trust one another, that we can sit down together and not feel threatened. And I think the premise of a framework such as this is not immune to identity per se, but I think it is very core to the fact that we can apply this across whether it is rural or big city, because really what everyone has talked about in the past frameworks as well is, you know, the sense of change or the sphere of being cut in line. That's across segments of society. That is not something that's isolated to people just in the inner city or people in rural areas. You know, if you look at, and I feel like we're going to the third section really with the civic leaders, but really we're not afraid of change. If we're going to quote Ron Heifetz from Leadership Studies, you know, we're not afraid of change, we're afraid of loss, and that sense of loss and that profound loss that comes with that change. So, you know, you wouldn't throw away a winning lottery ticket because that's great change, but you know inherently, even if you can't articulate it, that there is, with change comes some sort of loss to your lifestyle. And I think that is universal across all neighborhoods.
I want to talk about the relationships, and in particular, the photograph and the category relationships. But then you say civic relationships generate power, and I would just suggest that collaborative relationships may generate power and cut across geographical lines or any other kind of lines, but relationships do build communities and they do reflect the values and principles. And I think it's the relationships at the local level that create or at least make people aware that there may be something called a common good of which they are all partners and possibly beneficiaries. And so the relationships and who the people are that participate in that relationship building at the beginning to build a core or a foundation for then doing some of the collaborative work and having the deliberative discourse is the order in which it happens. And then you said once you have this kind of like relationships, then maybe civic collaboration with other people on the same block, with other tenants groups on the same block, may lead to the development of power. And then the other question that I have just floating in the back of all of this, one is that we don't talk about the common good enough generally. And then secondly, I'm not sure how all of this relates to electoral politics. And electoral politics is obviously a form of civic participation, civic engagement, but I don't think that's really, if we're talking about power building, I don't want all the power to be strictly and absolutely in the hands of the politicians and they're the only elected leaders. That's sort of like, we got to do collaborative work with those who are elected and getting them elected, but we also need to maintain the power at the level that this is talking about. They're in the street, they're in the backyard, or they're wherever they're sitting and talking.
Absolutely. I'll say one quick thing, but then I'm really going to leave it open.
Prophetic.
Oh, yeah, that was amazing. Snaps to all of what you just said, because these three are, they interact. You could come in at any point. It depends where you're at, where the community is. I mean, there are many people who don't vote for a lot of reasons, who may, because someone asks them to and they have a relationship with someone, then go vote. I mean, there's a lot of waving. Oh, sorry. And I just think it's really cyclical. And if from the last framework, what I feel like I was left with is a downward spiral, this is a point at which you might enter that cycle and start to shift it upwards. So it's not perfect and it doesn't work for every scenario, but can we gather up some power? Can we move it up to our elected officials? Can we work? The second bucket really incorporates a feedback loop with electeds, and so does the first. So it's not people outside the system necessarily. It's an interaction, and it's not necessarily well, we'll get to this a little bit in the next section, but I'll open. But thank you; those were excellent and much more eloquent points than I made. So thank you so much.
Can I respond to this? So first, I wanted to pick up on first of all, Hector. I had this wonderful experience meeting somebody I went to high school with, and who also is the dad of one of my former graduate students. So I'm going to answer Hector, but I see a tension with Erhard's question. So the way I saw Hector lay out the power issue fits pretty much with the model of organizing that Industrial Areas Foundation, faith-based community organizing, et cetera, has, is we build these relationships as a way of then leveraging a lot more power in the community than we might have. And I think that's a great model, by the way, and I think a lot of people have borrowed from it, and it's really good. But what I got from Erhard, and I think some other questions over the course of this conference so far, is that sometimes power is asserted simply in resistance and protest and really being on the outside and not necessarily having the opportunity or the insight or whatever it is to build those relationships. But what I do see in a lot of things that move forward is they figure out that they have to do that relationship building. If not this year, maybe next, or maybe the third, or maybe the fourth year. And you'd be surprised how many people kind of transform their own leadership skills, develop to the point of saying, well, I'm tired of just banging on the door from the outside. And I know that's not what you were saying, and it's not necessarily what Erhard is saying either, but we had a discussion yesterday in another setting, where that same issue of a more forceful, if you will, kind of confrontation with power.
I did want to also comment on Erhard's question about transfer of power. So I think I see civic relationship in a really sort of much broader, sort of a networky kind of way. So I think of what is sort of ideal civic network of relationships. And that network of relationship in ideal way should have sort of a code of conduct people can agree on, or systems or processes that is meant to really transfer powers all over the network so that it doesn't sit in one place. But I think it's really hard to do, because people that are in the power don't often see that they have the power. So I always really question sort of what is sort of the infrastructure need to really make sure that people do see the implicit and explicit biases that sort of necessitate the power transfer, so that people that are really meaning well to be there in a civic relationship actually do give up that power.
Let's do one more.
Can I just make a comment?
Yes, please.
Really important, because I think my point was that the infrastructure that we're talking about here is insufficient to distribute that power. And so that's why we need to think of that as an additional complexity to how we do it.
So we were asked about the definition of health. And for physiological reasons, partly for physiological reasons, health promotion researchers prefer the term control over power. That it's a sense that you are in control of the resources and the mental and physical activities and resources needed to give you a sense that you're in control. So I would debate whether or not power is equivalent to control in that sense. And I like your comments about power being exploitative. But it's a very important distinction, I think.
We're going to do one more, and then we're going to pause for a little experiment, and then we're going to a different conversation. But you in the orange can go before we start.
Had my hand up since the beginning. These folks back here are like, you need to stand up. I'm Megan Picard with Founding Forward Democracy Labs and the Athena Group. I wanted to push back a bit on the discussion about trust and relationships, and a couple of comments that trust is not necessary, and I firmly, in fact, disagree. And I want to tell you just a quick story about what I mean by this. Trust does not. Us having trust between one another does not necessarily mean we like each other. It does not, definitely does not mean we agree. What it does mean is, in my mind, is that when I say I'm going to do something, when we come to an agreement together, I will follow through on that. That, in order to have genuine, authentic, deliberative discourse and collaborative work, those cannot be effective unless you have that level of trust. And I also want to push back on the notion that it's not possible in some places. I have been doing this work for over 20 years. I have worked all over the country, urban, rural, across those divides, and I have seen it happen time and time again. I believe all of these things are critical, and I see relationships as absolutely foundational. So my quick story is working in a Midwest town, fallen manufacturing town, in which a couple of the leaders that I worked with, I had one in a community organization who also happened to be a school board member. He was on an opposite side, and this was a racially charged divide, with another woman who also served on the school board. Both lived and grew up in this small town. They knew of each other. They sat next to each other. They worked next to each other, and they were completely ineffectual and unable to move beyond this divide. And so they, in their spinning and trying to figure out what they're going to do in this community, they said, well, we want to take part in this great community-led, strategic planning effort. And so I went in and did a community assessment, a readiness assessment with them. And I said, not yet. We need to address these divides first, build some level of foundation so that you can get to that deliberative discourse and collaborative work and continue building those relationships, one thing that should be continuous throughout the entire process. So what I learned in that process was a couple of things. One, they were unable to hear each other. And they were unable to hear each other because they were completely unskilled at relationship building. And so part of the work that I do when I do community bridge building work is I go and work with those formal and informal leaders and model with them how to engage and how to build those relationships. And today, those two work hand in hand, completely collaboratively. Their whole networks working with them also come together, working collaboratively. They're able to talk. They were not even able to be in the same room together. These are the kinds of folks who I think when I hear y'all on the panel saying they're never going to come together, this is not true. As long as you respect that we can have conflicting even core values and that we're able to self-determine, then we're able to build that trust with reality on the table. I apologize for talking too long, but I just wanted to really get that out there.
No, we thank you for that point. I'm going to pause
Thank you.
just because we have a whole other section of this to try to get to, even though we could talk about this all day. And I wish I welcome you, please, to put stuff in the Google Doc. Thank you. And, I really hope to continue this conversation. I'll tell you a little bit more about how we can do that at the end. But let's pause and go back to the research synthesis so we could get your input on another portion that we have started to circle around. Well, here's sort of the update of where we left off. And so we're kind of thinking, do we have a place in this? Is there something to be done here? Where could we puncture the cycle and start to do some work? And we thought about who are we kind of doing this for, with, who are we approaching? And so let's just, there's obviously problems with the framework and we will continue to refine, but if we sort of posit that something like that could work, then the question becomes, what the heck is it that we do? How do we almost like operationalize something like this? And as I said before, we definitely don't have an answer. So our first question was, who would we turn to? Who could make this a reality? It's obviously not us alone. What is the entity that could help us? And then further questions, what do we ask of them? What do we need to know? So for our project, we have identified, and this is a question mark, and see what you think, civic leaders as the right place to look. And by this we don't mean people necessarily in elected office, although they could be. We don't necessarily mean people with money or power, although they could be. It could be very informal. It could be very, very local. We have in mind sort of like block by block kind of people who offer opportunities for people to engage, many of whom are often overlooked and sort of don't think of themselves as civic leaders, but actually that is the work that they're doing. So that's who we have in mind. And in our next sort of phase of this, and if we get good feedback from you guys and others, we'll start to create sort of almost like profiles of types of civic leaders, and we'll be able to be more specific about that in future iterations. But for now, we're kind of talking about everyone from the local neighborhood watch lady to the people doing the blood drive to the PTA people, but also people really without titles who are facilitating civic work in their neighborhoods. And we think there's about 1 million of them out there, which means they have really big reach, which means that we can't, it would be hard to replicate this, but there's also some problems about going to civic leaders. They lack resources in certain cases. They're not networked together. They sometimes struggle to be diverse. They struggle to sort of reflect the whole person or the whole community. So it's definitely not perfect. And certainly don't always use these three pieces or some of the other frameworks that we heard about this morning. And so there's not a perfect scenario here, but and certainly there's not enough of them. We definitely think for this to be done properly for each community, we don't even have enough civic leaders, and we need to figure out how to bring new ones to the mix and new voices to the mix, and how to sort of swell the ranks of our civic infrastructure. So while we don't yet know, there's that. And so while we don't yet know sort of where the next steps lie or what it is that we want to do to operationalize this, we do have a couple of core values before we open it back up to the group that we want you to know that we're sort of using as guardrails. One is that every American is a problem solver, and totally inclusive of everyone who lives in each community is sort of part of the solution. We believe in positivity and possibility, and that doesn't mean that we turn away from anger or discord. We're not trying to paper over differences, but we have a focus on using what resources we have at our disposal to take next steps and to continue to build and see what's achievable. We focus on the facts, as you see, because we have 125 pieces of research that we're using here. So we do try to adhere to that, but also to lived experiences and voices from communities that we're thinking about. We think big and small. We're a rising tide, meaning that we're not trying to build something totally new. We're trying to build on top of a lot of work that's already been done and lift up pieces of that are really working. And we're totally nonpartisan, and we're totally issue agnostic, and trying to sort of let shine what is crucial and important to people. So with that in mind, and with our vision, I'll leave this on the screen. Our next questions are around A, is approaching civic leaders existing and future, is that a good strategic move? Could we do this through a different audience? Would we be better off trying to reach individuals directly, and then we'll follow up with a couple of sub-questions, but I have a feeling there's probably a lot to say just on that. So opening back up to the group and to the panel. Yes. Thank you. I'll let you adjudicate.
Who's that?
A little exercise.
Thank you. So I just want to say how much this discussion this afternoon has made my heart sing, particularly when the words geography, local, and urban and rural are brought into the conversation. I don't know if there's anybody else from my tribe here, but I am, in fact, a geographer. And I just want to, before I get to answer this question, I want to push back quite strongly against the idea that geography, place, and spatial relationships have not been studied within the social sciences, because they have. This research has been very community-based, it's been participatory, and it's been going on since the 1970s. The problem is that we're a small discipline, and also we've lived in a silo. And I think that we very much need groups like this to connect with, but I also think that you need us. And so one of the things that I wanted to suggest is that in relationship to this question is that there's been a lot of research done recently in Canada on what's called youth geographies, and is looking specifically as youth, high school students, middle school students, as not only emerging civic leaders, but also as people who can get stuff done. And in particular, there's been research done about this at University of Toronto, University of British Columbia, University of Victoria, Simon Fraser University. There's this whole collection of people working in this area, and it's starting to spill over into the United States. So what I wanted to do was issue an invitation, because we have probably 150 to 200 panels that focused specifically on civic engagement and community-based work at our annual meeting for the American Association of Geographers. I'd really love to invite you to come to that meeting in April, and it's in New Orleans, and so we will all pass a good time down there. So if you have any interest in doing this, please get in touch with me. My name is Ann Mosier. I'm at Syracuse University, and my email address is amosher, AMOSHER, @syr.edu. Thank you.
I actually want to clarify one thing. Did you think
Oh, I said it.
Okay.
I said recently. You said but social science.
Actually, what I was implying was that the broad civic community doesn't take the work of geography into account sufficiently. So essentially that we tend to be place. Okay. Well, in that case is never mind.
Was it you?
Hi, I am very excited about this work. It sounds very familiar. I co-run New Hampshire Listens, which is a statewide organization that has local and regional groups that are about sustaining civic infrastructure. And so your 3 boxes were interesting to me because we talk about problem solving, community building, and sharing information, information sharing. And so it's interesting to think about where's the social cohesion, the relationship across all of it, trust and equity. In terms of in some ways, the idea of starting with individual people, because, I definitely affirm that when you move from actually creating a little bit more social capital and the bridging and binding and all that, you got to have individuals involved, right? And I think most of us in the room realize that the PTA leader and the informal, immigrant community leader, and that there's a whole mix of formal and informal leadership that takes. We have found that somebody still needs to sort of wake up and bring people together, and be a diplomat, and be someone who is who can connect to the totally on the ground neighborhood grandma and the CEO or whatever, and try and create spaces that are shared. And we in a previous workshop today, our system right now is not set up to fund, have the resources to help us all collaborate. We have really good individual spaces for advocacy, for dialogue, for a day of service, and so to find ways to sort of knit that together is actually part of, of what's in here. I do think that when I've seen, two other points, we don't dictate what a local listens group looks like. They're locally run, locally owned and operated. They sign on to principles. And there's one that's connected to a Rotary Club. There's one that's connected to a youth organization. There's one that's part of a theater. And so you can do this and look lots of different ways, right? Which I know you know. But being nimble about what it looks like to be what's getting leveraged, I think, is something to think about and necessary. And I've seen the network that gets built pay off in voting. A youth table at a candidate conversation that's being run differently, and a mom who brought the youth to the teen table, voted for the first time. That kind of stuff, which is the way I sort of connected to the electoral piece. So.
He's had his hand up for a while.
All right, come over to the side.
Did anyone have a response?
He's had his hand up.
Okay. So I wanted to say a word about civic leaders. And I was really happy to hear you mention civic leaders without titles. And I think that this is an important distinction. So when we're searching for civic leaders in communities, I think that it's easy to identify civic leaders in a way that we may have done in the past, like looking on the internet for people who are heads of volunteer organizations or work in local government. But that approach, I think, doesn't necessarily work for low-income communities. And it's really important to consider the kind of approach that we're taking to identifying civic leaders, depending on the kind of population that we're looking to connect with. And so I think that you're going to find a lot of civic leaders are doing grassroots work out of their houses, don't necessarily have titles. And the way that you'll find those people is by relationship building and really like doing a deep dive into the community and talking with people. And so I guess I would love to hear the panel speak. I'm just curious about, this, since civic leaders is such a big part of what you've identified here, how you're thinking of connecting with more marginalized groups and identifying civic leaders.
I'd like to make one comment about that. Just, I want to leave it open for other people to address it too. I mean, this has been done for a long time within that community. McKnight and Kretzman's work about assets-based development, Robert Sampson's, magnificent book, Great American City on Chicago, has actually talked about ecologies of civic participation in low-income communities. So my larger point is that there's a lot that we could learn about this. And one of my problems, and I feel like I'm the crab of the group in some ways, but one of the problems is that one of the things I like the most about Joe and Donata's presentation is that it actually modeled relationships and dependencies. So it wasn't just a set of pots that we could sort of bring together in a variety of ways. It was a set of processes that actually fed into each other in very specific kinds of loops. It was social scientific in that sense, that it actually took what we already knew and boiled it down into a set of relationships that were restrictive. And one of the problems bluntly within this community is that I've heard this, we reinvent the wheel almost constantly. So relationships are important. Well, we've known that for a very long time, but what kinds of relationships, what kind of civic leaders, across what kinds of communities, how do we reach them? And I would love to see a more collaborative set of relationships between, social scientists, geographers, among others, who are working on these problems, and the kind of policy narrative models that we saw in the Democracy Fund presentation, which are not strictly speaking system models, but they're actually narrative models, taking sets of relationships and telling stories about them, and then ask how those can be translated to work on the ground in communities. And those are three very distinct processes. So having a lot of research is good, but there's a lot of people who are used to boiling down research and actually saying how research contradicts itself, how these relationships can be clarified, what we know already. And I feel like my concern about this process is that it reminds me of a number of other ones where we restate what we already know in slightly new language, put it together in sort of slightly different ways, and ignore a lot of what we really have known for a very long time.
I think that's a wonderful question, but I would push back and say that we actually don't know very much about civic leaders, that the bulk of our research in this space is actually very much on the dis, which is the disengaged, the disenfranchised, the people who don't show up to the table. We know why people don't want to vote. We looked at 1.5 million reasons why people didn't want to vote for any of the candidates last election cycle. We know what keeps people from participating. But there's a very limited, if you do a scan, there's a very limited knowledge about what we know about these uber citizens who show up to the table, who work very hard for immigrant rights despite already attaining their citizenship. Those people, the abuelas in communities of color who decide that they're going to adopt 5 city blocks and start scholarship funds for students. we actually don't know what makes them tick, what develops their identity. So I think that's the new piece. Just anecdotally, if you were to, my trade prior to joining the Reagan Foundation was that of a classroom teacher. And if I were to always teach my class to the lowest common denominator, hey guys, go vote, right? That's what we ask people to do in civic participation. Like that would actually lead to pretty low participation in the class or barely passing. So these high aspirations, similarly, we want tolerance, which is a pretty low bar as well. Oh boy, I can tolerate Edna, I can sit here next to her, it's gonna be great. But really, we really do need to raise the bar, and I think that's why looking and finding those civic leaders and knowing more about them to replicate processes, if potentially we can, which I know is not empirical. Most of the work in leadership and civic engagement is not empirical, but having a higher aspiration may not get us there, but at least it will get us further than we already are.
I just want to say one more quick thing. So I think also there's something about the recruitment or induction of younger and newer members of the community into the pipeline of civic leadership, because the sort of who rises to the top of civic leadership, however informal that might be, is usually dependent on the existing relationship within the civic network. I'm a little bit concerned about how we're actually really interrogating how that process is really truly equitable right now, because our friends tend to be people that are similar to us in different ways. So how do we break out of the cycle? Have we really fully interrogated that? I don't know.
I certainly don't.
No, we're definitely.
So we're right at 4:15. We want to take more time for questions.
That's what Peter called.
You choose. I just want to endorse the comment. Sorry, go ahead. From the woman who was talking about the youth participation programs in Canada, that I think that involving youth systematically and profoundly in civic engagement and civic leadership is extremely important. And I'd very much like to see those programs adopted in the United States. I'll look them up in terms of how they're doing in Canada. But I think that in our developmental studies, it appears that the ages of 10 to 14, up to 7th, 8th grade, is really a critical period. I mean, it's a sensitive period for engaging young people. And it maps right on to what's called the age crime curve, which is universal. That crime peaks at ages 17, 18, and 19, and then falls off as people become connected to good marriages and jobs and opportunity structures. And so this age group between 10 and 15 or 16 are the group that are vulnerable and marginalized in most communities. And targeting civic engagement on that age group is a very important, critical aspect of having civic engagement work for everybody in the community.
Last one of it.
Okay. Peter says last question.
I have a microphone.
Oh, that means you're next.
So I was hoping to add what may be more of a political infrastructure problem on this, which I'm seeing this, and I come more from the advocacy world, and I am struck by the fact that currently there is a plan being hatched by Chris Kobach and Mike Pence to release a report that will result in an attempt to pass a national voter disenfranchisement set of bills that will intentionally disenfranchise a large number of Americans. And that's happening already on the state level. But it certainly feels like we are living in a time where there is, if not a highly sophisticated effort to exclude people from participating. And it is well coordinated, it is well funded, and it is ramping up, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. I wonder if that's a challenge for trust, if that will trickle down into the level of civic participation that we see here in a local level. And I wonder if it also should be in this conversation. Is it a political conversation that's different than a civic conversation? And where do those things combine? Because through this conversation today, I'm actually seeing them diverge more than interact in a way that is a little bit unexpected for me. So I wanted to leave at that question or problem.
I would, but I've said too much.
Well, I don't know. I'll just say that I'll write that down and think about how that, I mean, it certainly does interact. But, I feel like we can name a million problems, but we're asking you guys if this is a decent place to sort of insert ourselves, knowing that the forces allied and arrayed against participation are vast. Is this a starting point that works? Maybe not. We're really not beholden to anything. So
if I may.
Please.
If I may, I think that they both diverge and intersect and move apart, and it's fluid and constant. I think we go back to identity where, we are not seeing each other as humans. We don't know each other anymore. And I think that identity piece that's brought up is critical in both civic and political work. What we fail to understand sometimes or fail to see in one another is when we attack someone for being a D or an R. It's not that we're attacking 2% of them or 1% of them. We can't unravel our identity. We're actually attacking their mother who raised them, a mentor who helped them through school. We're attacking so much more. So we really, when we speak about one another, that distance is really crippling to any sort of civic work that we want to do together. And that's why those relationships and that collaboration is so critical.
So my question about that, I think, is there's also a challenge to have the result be divorced from the production of it, to not have an origin story behind why we have a political system that is the way it is also, I think, a big challenge. And to not name the actors and where things came from creates a real lack of civic education about why the system doesn't feel like it represents us or what have you. So how do you do that without going on attack mode?
I think that's where we go back to civic leaders, and this is all hypothesis on my part, and really, actually, the leadership literature has not been tested either. I want to put it out there. But when we talk about civic leaders and we talk about this fear of change, these civic leaders need to have the ability to manage loss, because we lose a bit of our cultural DNA. We see this in the fact that this incredible distrust of this current administration, doesn't begin with this current administration. It goes back historically. And how can we ever repair that? So this cultural DNA that we carry with us as Americans gets lost in the process. And that's, can be irreparable if we allow it to be. But I think if we speak about it in productive terms and we know each other, we can potentially speak about issues. But we're not even at the point right now where we can speak to one another without attacking one another. So I think it starts in small processes, but that's why it starts local. That is a posit.
I think we have to end, unfortunately, but if you would like to keep the conversation going, and I would like to keep the conversation going with you, so please either bring me your cards or write down your emails, put stuff in the Google Doc that you want us to incorporate into this. We'll be, I don't know if you guys knew, but we're recording here, so we'll take pieces of what everyone has said and find answers to them in the deck. Thank you so much. This was enriching for us.
I love how you told them you were recording after.
This is the last session of today, and by long frontiers of democracy tradition, it is a short takes session, which means 4 10-minute talks. It's not a panel, so actually the talks have been chosen for their diversity. They're not really addressing any obvious common theme. They're 4 provocative 10-minute talks that are meant to just add thoughts to your ongoing discussions and deliberations. So after they've each spoken, there will be no Q&A, and a lot of you know this. Instead, they may like to join a table, but I certainly will, and we'll just talk about what you've heard. Very often, serendipitous connections or contrasts are made. Also, per long frontiers tradition, we really don't do introductions. Partly it's about time, and partly it's about reducing a little bit the difference between audience and speaker. So we've actually had some very famous speakers, and we haven't given them any more than couple sentences of introduction over the years. So, and these guys are famous too. So I'm just going to tell you who they are, and then I'm going to time them, but that's all it is. So first up is Hardy Merriman, who is president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. So bringing you intense expertise, advanced expertise from the world of nonviolent conflict, social movements. Also a sometime teacher at Tufts. Rekha Datta is right here, the professor of political science at Monmouth University, but also going to talk about work she does globally. She'll talk to you about the work that she does. Ashley Trim is executive director of the Davenport Institute for Public Engagement and Civic Leadership in Malibu, Los Angeles, at Pepperdine University. And it says on the program, Carol Rose, executive director of the ACLU. Carol really, really wanted to come here. I've been talking to her all day on the phone. Her doctor says she shouldn't because she might be contagious. So we have the excellent, non-contagious, and equally awesome Laura Rótolo, who's staff counsel and community advocate for ACLU of Massachusetts, and I believe a Tufts alum. Yeah. So with no further ado, Hardy.
Great, thanks. I got to set my time here. There we go. Thanks, Peter. It's nice to be here. I'm having a you know you're not in DC when moment. I think I'm the only one who has a tie here. It's 95 degrees, but folks, I showed up in a jacket and tie. That's a very DC thing to do. That's where I'm coming from. I'm president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. For the last 15 years, I have looked at nonviolent movements around the world that are struggling for human rights, freedom, and justice. I've looked at movements for minority rights, women's rights, labor rights, democracy, self-determination, environmental protection, and increasingly I look at movements for good government and against corruption, a really endemic problem that I feel like certainly is relevant now to almost every country in the world. I've looked at movements against governments, movements taking on corporations, and even movements taking on non-state actors like the mafia or groups that practice political violence. And the one thing that a lot of the circumstances that I look at have in common is that most people don't resort to nonviolent struggle if the system's working. In fact, I tend to look at places where the system is like completely broken. So sort of when nothing else works, what do people do? When elections are fraudulent, or where a minority in a democracy is being oppressed to the point that they can never garner the kind of democratic representation they would need in the institutions of power by elections alone to redress their grievances. Or cases where the legal system is functionally shut off from people. It just costs too much to get access to it, or it itself is corrupted and no longer impartial. Situations where third parties that are supposed to protect or intervene against those who are oppressed or intervene on behalf of those who are oppressed are sitting on the sidelines or sometimes exacerbating things and making them worse. So I don't know why, but I've gravitated to these really tough cases to try to figure out against really powerful, entrenched governments and corporations, many of them in non-democratic settings, but some of them in democratic settings and some in semi-democratic settings. How do ordinary people organize themselves to actually win? What can they do when the institutions are shut off from them? It's been a fascinating question. I haven't grown tired of asking it. And since I only have 10 minutes, I'll really simplify the sort of dilemma faced by people. So one thing people can do in those circumstances, they can take the wait and see approach. Let's keep our head down. Let's be obedient up to the point where we don't get into trouble, and let's see if things change. Now, occasionally that works out. I tend to believe that Frederick Douglass was right when he said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. You show me show me the injustice that a people will quietly submit to, and that is the exact measure of injustice that will be visited upon them until it's resisted. And so the wait and see approach can save people's skin, but it doesn't necessarily result in system improvement, and oftentimes it can allow the system to continue to atrophy. Another thing, of course, we know people do is they take up arms sometimes, they engage in violence. And then this third option of civil resistance, non-violently organizing themselves, unifying, and engaging in tactics such as strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, mass demonstrations, and many, many, many other kinds of exerting nonviolent pressure, social pressure, political pressure, economic pressure. And I look at this as a social scientist. I look at what the scholars are saying about these movements and why they succeed or fail. And I also work with practitioners around the world to try to learn what are the best practices that are working with them, working for them, what actually works on the ground. And so in my 6 minutes that remain, I was told to provoke. I'm not sure how provocative this will be, but I'm going to talk about a few quantitative findings coming straight from the scholarship, and then I'll talk about some of the key points that I've also learned from working with practitioners that I feel are very complementary to those scholarly findings. So the first data point I want to give you is that nonviolent movements challenging governments, many of which are highly authoritarian, trying to change those governments, tend to succeed at twice the rate of violent insurgency. This is a finding from the book Why Civil Resistance Works. My foundation, the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, funded the data set that fed into this book. And we supported Erica Chenoweth in creating the first data set looking at 323 violent and nonviolent campaigns around the world, all struggling for what we call maximalist objectives, trying to get self-determination or oust a foreign occupier, or actually change a government. So really tough stuff. And this is one of the key findings from the book, and it defies conventional expectation, with violence seemingly the strongest sanction that a population could use, or the means of last resort. In fact, historically, it doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold up when you have a 2-to-1 difference in success. So nonviolent power is a lot more powerful than most people commonly assume. And here is a graph that's not very pretty. Let's see if I can make it a little better. Just to graphically show you the results. Here you have blue, success rate of nonviolent movements versus violent insurgency, partial success and failure. And that's over 100 years. This book won the American Political Science Association Award for Book of the Year. So I trust that APSA did their methodology check. They banged on it to see if anything fell apart. You wouldn't think of the American Political Science Association endorsing these findings without rigorously vetting them. And they gave it Book of the Year in 2012. But there's more. Let's look at what happens after a movement succeeds. If you look 5 years after a nonviolent movement succeeds in ending a government that is oppressive, you see a 57% chance of a democratic outcome. If you look at a violent insurgency, the chance of a democratic outcome if they succeed is 6%. So we're looking at a 9.5 to 1 differential there. Maybe that's not surprising to people in this room, but still, it couldn't be more clear. There's absolutely no guarantee of success here, right? We know in the Arab Spring there was backsliding. We know in other cases there was backsliding. We know in Syria there was a civil war. But we also can see quite clearly from this century-long data set that comparatively, certainly to violence, it has a much better probability. And even to top-down driven transitions, citing another study done by Freedom House in 2005, which have about a 20% chance of democratic consolidation, where you basically have elites get together and do a roundtable with no grassroots participation. So this is pretty amazing. What's also amazing is that even when a nonviolent movement fails to achieve its stated objectives, they looked 5 years after the movement ended, and there was still a 35% chance of a democratic outcome. This leads to a view that we can see in the case studies, and now we see it quantifiably, to show that there are sort of seeds of democracy, seeds of deliberative democracy planted by these movements. They have enormous demonstration effects to others within the society, and they can still lead to residual effects that are highly constructive towards creating future political state that yields human rights, greater rights, and freedom and democracy. Another data point, these movements are increasing. So this is tracking onset of nonviolent and violent movements around the world. Again, these are all maximalist struggles taking on states. A lot of interesting work done on subnational struggles, again, against corruption, or for various rights-based claims that are not trying to change the state, but this is the stuff that is being counted most now, so this is what I'm reporting on. And if we look in the decade of the 1990s, you see about 26 cases of these movements. If you look in 2000 to 2010, you see 52, 53. You look in the first 3 years of this decade, you're up to about 27, 28. And actually, the more recent numbers for 2010 to 2015 come in and show that we're at 48 in the first 5 years of this decade. We're on track to be at 96. So these movements, what can we say? Number one, they're a lot more powerful than people commonly assume. Number two, they tend to lead to democracy more often, despite recent backsliding that we've seen. And number three, a lot of people are trying this. So this begs the question of, well, what causes them to succeed? And I've got to speed up. What do I have, a minute left?
Yeah.
I haven't even gotten to my main point yet.
Yes.
I'll simply say this. I'll just expedite. There's a constant debate in social science about structure and agency. Is it the conditions in which these movements emerge and that shapes their outcome, or is it the choices that they make? We've looked, the research has looked at regime type. It has looked at use of violent repression against movements. It's looked at regime strength. It's looked at the kind of economy in which movements happen. It's looked at the educational level. It's looked at how multi-ethnic the societies are. And it's done a fairly blunt look at third-party support for movements. None of these have proven determinative. The biggest one that we have in terms of influence is violent repression reduces the movement's chance by 35%, but that's not the whole story. Lots of movements can survive that. 35% isn't 100%. So if it's not the conditions, then clearly skills and choice matter. In this group, I came well armed with studies, so if I got asked any questions, I could go back. So I just want to finish by saying, look, if it's not just the conditions, and I truly believe it's not, and that's part of what the literature supports at this point, what are some common factors across movements, attributes that help them succeed, that movements actually have some control over, unlike their environmental conditions in the short term they don't? What are the things that they can orient a strategy around to help them succeed? And these seem like really basic, big ideas. But if you've sat around and talked about a movement in country X, whether it's, what's the state of resistance in the United States right now? What's the state of the movement right now in Russia? What's the state of the movement right now in country A, country B? And you sit with 20 people, everyone's going to cite a different factor that they think is determinative. Well, yeah, but did you see the recent statement by the government? Did you see the recent law? But what about the recent protest? There's a lot that we can focus on. There's something very valuable about distilling down some of the most salient factors and orienting strategy around those. Movements that win tend to have a significant degree of unity. They invest in strategic planning and building that capacity among their people, and they maintain nonviolent discipline. Unity is important, simply numbers matter. Gender diversity, racial and ethnic diversity, urban-rural diversity, class diversity, sexual orientation, and so forth may be very significant in these movements. You don't get numbers if you're talking to yourselves all the time. You have to reach beyond. We also know that greater participation tends to make movements more resilient against repression, tends to cause back defections from the movement's opponent, and gives them a much greater tactical repertoire so they can go beyond protest. So participation is critical. You can't get there unless you consciously try to build unity. Strategy. This is the most basic level. Movement has a vision, campaigns, these are intermediate objectives, and tactics for short-term goals that work in sync. If you're doing this, lots of tactics with no organizing principle, it's very hard to succeed. No clear goals, lots of really interesting ideas, but no clear cohesion. And this clearly relates to unity as well. So that's the strategy piece. And there's the famous quote. The last thing, then I'll stop, is nonviolent discipline. Any strategy requires discipline, whether you're in business, military, or politics, or anything else. Nonviolent means maximize participation. When people are violent, who goes home? People who don't want to be violent. Tends to sometimes break down on gender lines as well as age lines. So you start getting a movement that's not representative anymore. It starts being a lot more about young men. Violence confronts the oppressor where the oppressor is strongest. It gives an excuse for oppression. It reduces defections from the opponent and backfire against their repression against the movement. So again, quick diagnostic. You go to the doctor's office, you get a checkup, they ask you some formulaic questions. They seem very simple, but they're revealing. Quick rule of thumb, how's the movement doing? What's the state of its unity? What's the state of its planning? What's the state of its nonviolent discipline? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. So when Peter invited me to offer a conservative perspective on the themes of this conference, I had a little bit of trepidation. It may be possible for you to imagine that it's not necessarily the most fun time in the world to be a young female conservative in 2017. And I thought about throwing caution to the wind and reviving an argument I had with my Trump voter families about how the problems with Trump are actually that he's a liberal, but I decided that that level of provocation was worthy of Sam Adams, and if I'm going to invoke his ghost, I'll do it at the Green Dragon later tonight. But seriously, as I considered what I had to offer a discussion around global turns to authoritarianism, I kept coming back to one issue that I suspected would not be covered elsewhere, and I hope it is provocative, but provocative in a way that's constructive for all of us. So here it is. Authoritarianism comes in a variety of forms on the right and on the left, and we would be remiss to address authoritarianism in our electoral democracy while ignoring it in civil institutions that underpin that democracy, and I'm thinking particularly of universities. We would be remiss to spend several days talking about the challenges facing democracy without acknowledging the challenges to free speech that many American campuses are facing, not just the protests of Milo Yiannopoulos at pretty much every campus on the West Coast or of Ann Coulter at Berkeley, but maybe more surprisingly of Charles Murray at Middlebury or Heather McDonald at Claremont McKenna. And also to acknowledge that these student-led protests or challenges coincide with formal challenges, or what many perceive to be formal challenges to free speech in the administration of Title IX. I've had conversations with both liberal and conservative professors who are trying to navigate the ill-defined but ever-expanding world of microaggressions and trigger warnings, and who are well aware that tenure may not be the protection for them that it was for their more radical predecessors in the 60s and 70s. So as a woman with an advanced degree and an administration level appointment at a university, I'm a fan of anti-discrimination, but I also live in a society that's facing difficult questions about both personal and group and cultural identity. And in this society, we need our universities to be a place where conservatives can engage with liberals in philosophical and, dare I say, theological conversations about the scopes and limits of human choice, as well as where liberals can have honest and difficult conversations with each other about difficult topics like what the rise of the transgender movement means for traditional feminism. And we need to be able to have these conversations in and outside the classroom without fear of repercussions. If for no other reason, we need to be able to have these conversations because if universities aren't leading them, someone else will. And if the ones to pick up the mantle are non-traditional media and political outsiders, we won't be having conversations, we'll be having a shouting match. So where do we go from here? I want to leave us with two challenges or charges that I hope will help us defend liberty, if I may say so, in both our civil and our political institutions. So my first challenge is this. We must work harder than ever in pursuit of a confident pluralism, to borrow a title from a brilliant little book by John Inazu. I don't know if anyone else was a little taken aback by some of the offerings for tomorrow's plenary session, but when I looked at things like winning the next election with a different majority, resisting the administration in institutional settings, resisting the administration outside institutional settings, and changing the regime, my first thought was, if I'd received this email 3 years ago, I would have thought it came from the John Birch Society. But apart from a lack of nuance, I think what bothered me about this was an implicit assumption of consensus in framing topics like winning the next election or resisting the administration. I'm not a fan of Trump, but I can guarantee that what winning the next election looks like for me is very different than what it looks like for many people in the room, and it's difficult for me to figure out where I fit in that conversation as framed. Now, I suspect that in many ways, this is simply a result of siloization and conservatives certainly bear our share of the responsibility for why there are so few of us in rooms like this one. And my social media suggests that there are plenty of spaces where conservatives can make similar assumptions, but as a conservative in academia, I'm not really in those spaces. Where I do find myself fairly often is in very well-intentioned conversations at conferences, trying to decide whether it's worth it for me to admit that I'm not a fan of high-speed rail, or that I actually think the immigration question is complicated by the regulatory state and the burdens it places on small business. Or, by the way, I think abortion is morally wrong. And I'm guessing that there are many people who fall to the left of the mainstream who also have some of these internal debates. Now, the burden on me in these situations is to be a bold advocate of my own perspective. But the burden for those who fall within the mainstream of polite intellectual society is to be conscious of their own assumptions about the point of agreement and disagreement. Even if it were safe to assume that no one in this room voted for Trump, it would be dangerous to do so. If there is someone here who voted for him frankly and who's still willing and able to come to this type of a convening, I want to hear from them. And I want it to be possible and safe for him or her to speak up, which leads directly into my second challenge, which is that we need to model disagreement. A couple weeks ago, I was in Salt Lake City at the conference for the University Network for Collaborative Governance, and a colleague who teaches dispute resolution and collaborative problem solving shared his experience asking students to identify examples of distrust in case stories. He said almost universally, these well-educated, thoughtful men and women identified not examples of distrust, but examples of disagreement, and that they had a very difficult time distinguishing between the two. I think that's something that should be disturbing to all of us. It can be tempting in times of perceived political crisis to emphasize that reasonable people agree more than we disagree, and that may be true. But we must guard against allowing this to become a way of dismissing real disagreements among reasonable people, thereby lending credibility to the sense that we all have sometimes that those who disagree with us are unreasonable. History is full of examples where unity against a perceived crisis silenced much-needed voices of dissent or caution, from the reign of terror to the war on terror. Disagreement is hard. It's difficult to grant credibility to someone whose conclusions we find untenable. It's much easier to give in to the temptation of demolishing a straw man than it is to seek genuine points of departure. It's easier for conservatives to accuse liberals of wanting to kill babies than it is to address ongoing stigmas of single parenthood and the foster care crisis in America. On the other hand, it's easier for liberals to accuse conservatives of wanting to subjugate women than to address legitimate moral questions about how we define and prioritize life, particularly given the abortion rates of the unborn who are diagnosed with Down syndrome and other non-typical development. It's easier to build a coalition around a solution to a simplified problem than it is to acknowledge that we may not have the answer to difficult problems. One of the best things I've encountered this year is a TEDx talk by Megan Phelps Roper, who's formerly of Westboro Baptist Church and is now married to the son of a Jewish rabbi. And she describes her journey out of Westboro via, of all things, a Twitter exchange, which she describes, as I'm quoting here, full of genuine curiosity on both sides. How had the other come to such outrageous conclusions about the world? It's into the quote. Now, if we're honest with ourselves, we often find it easier to dismiss the outrageous conclusions of others than we do to engage with them. One of the things Megan emphasizes is the need to make the argument. We can't expect others to spontaneously change their own minds. And when it comes right down to it, the other may not change their own mind. We may change our minds, as Megan did, or we may continue to fundamentally disagree on foundational claims, on the comparative value of different arguments, or on the appropriate prioritization of conflicting interests. But we will be far better equipped for deliberation, whatever our position on the political spectrum, with a far better awareness of when we're able to collaborate, when we are willing to compromise, and when, as will sometimes be the case, we need to stand on principle. But if we can understand these things about each other, we will be able to build trust even where there is disagreement here on the frontiers of democracy.
Oh, there you go. Hi, everybody. So my name is Laura Rótolo. I'm with the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts. And I'm here filling in for my boss, Carol Rose, who sends her regrets and got sick and didn't want to get you all sick. What I want to talk today about is sort of more strategy. I just want to use our organization, the ACLU, as kind of a case study of how we think change happens and how we try to affect change. I don't know how provocative it'll be, but hopefully it'll get us thinking a little bit more. And I just want to begin with a story. In 1970, two men by the names of Richard Baker and James Michael McConnell tried to get married in Minnesota. They went to City Hall, they applied for a marriage license, and they were denied. For those of you who are not from the US, I'll just explain that in the United States, marriage is very much a local and state issue. The federal government does not have the authority to grant marriage licenses. Only states can do that. And so when Minnesota denied Mr. McConnell and Mr. Baker their license to get married, they sued. And they went to court in state court in Minnesota. And the case made it to the Supreme Court of Minnesota. There were 9 justices on the bench, and not a single justice asked a single question of the attorney representing Baker and McConnell. In fact, it's told that one of the justices turned his back during the entire argument. The ACLU tried to get the United States Federal Supreme Court to intervene. And in 1970, the Supreme Court didn't even ask for oral argument, didn't ask for written briefs, but dismissed the case with one sentence. The appeal is dismissed for want of a substantial federal question. It wasn't even a question that the Supreme Court was ready to hear. Now, for the ensuing decades, the United States became a map of how we talk about gender, how we talk about sexuality, and what the rights of those people are under the law. And so we saw some states grant the right to same-sex marriage, other states outrightly ban it. We can bring this back to what Ashley was talking about in terms of how we talk about disagreement. This was a huge disagreement. Now, fast forward to 2015. The Supreme Court was faced with the same exact question. Does our Constitution guarantee the right to marriage to same-sex couples? And in a 5-4 decision in a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court recognized, 5-4, again, very much divided, that the Constitution provides a right to marry and that that right applies equally to same-sex couples as it does to opposite-sex couples. Now, what changed in those years, in those decades? Yes, the court itself changed. There were different justices on the court, but if anything, it was socially more conservative now than it was in 1970. So what else changed? What changed was the culture. What changed was how Americans felt about this issue. And we still don't all agree. It was still a 5-4 decision, but there was a huge shift. And so what some people think this part is controversial, but the way some people see this is that the court didn't so much, I'm just going to quote from a book by David Cole, who is a professor and has recently joined the ACLU as our legal director. And he talks about this in a book called Engines of Liberty, about how change happens, especially through the courts. He says the Obergefell court did not so much rewrite constitutional law as recognize that it had been rewritten. How does that happen? The decision is correct not because it comports with liberal values, but because it reflects an extended transformation in how America's fundamental values apply to lesbians and gays. In the case of marriage equality, that development occurred not because federal judges imposed their own views, but through understandings forged over time in local governments, private businesses, state courts, legislatures, ballot initiatives, the media, and personal conversations. The conversation has shifted dramatically. By the time 2015 came around, people knew more gay people. Gay people have gotten married and the world had not ended. Gay people were adopting families and kids were growing up healthy and fine. And I think everyone was sort of just more aware of what was happening, but that didn't happen on its own. That happened through decades of advocacy. And the same happens, in the other spectrum of politics in the United States. This book also goes into the gun rights battle as a case study in how the court has shifted in that direction, again, by the work of advocates. Now, we at the ACLU have a certain point of view, of course, but we believe in what we call integrated advocacy. And so as a strategy, we know that it's not enough to go into court and file a lawsuit. It's not enough to pass a law, as good as the law is. It has to be a full package. And the components of those are obviously, we have a legal team. We have a fantastic legal team with top-notch, litigators, but they don't work alone. So I work in the legal department, but I'm also in our field department. I'm also an organizer, and that's by design because we know that it's not enough to bring a lawsuit. We work in the legislatures. We've got great lobbyists that do that work, but that is also supported by the people who do our media work, right? So you can't just go up and file a bill at the State House or in Congress. That has to be supported by civil society, and we take our cues from civil society. We're not going to mount a campaign that a community doesn't want. We're not going to fight for the rights of a group that doesn't want that. So we are informed by civil society and supported by civil society. We do administrative advocacy as well. Sometimes it takes a small tweak by a governor or by a mayor, and that gets the ball rolling. But that's together with all of our other advocacy. And we work at multiple levels on all these strata. So in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is a very sort of colonial setup, the way our government works here. Obviously, in the United States, we have 50 states plus DC and Puerto Rico, but within each state, we have many local governments. So in Massachusetts, we have 351 cities and towns, each of which has its own local government of elected officials. Don't get me started on what it's like to do advocacy in the state. It is hyper local, sometimes down to the street level, where in Arlington, Massachusetts, there are like hundreds of town meeting members who are elected, by like little tiny 3-block areas of Arlington, Massachusetts, and they are responsive to their constituents, all 16 of them. And you have to convince each one of those town meeting members to pass a local ordinance. So we start at the very local level and build it up. My job right now is focusing on immigration, immigrant rights, especially this year. And we are working at the very local level to pass very good protective policies, city by city, town by town, and then at the state level as well, and then at the federal level. Some cities call themselves sanctuary cities, others use welcoming city, whatever term they use, the idea is to build from the ground up these policies. And we do that in this integrated manner. And we harness the power of people who have come to us, especially after the election, who are really, really motivated to do something. We can generate calls to legislators. We can do petitions. We can have rallies. And that all came to a head, really, after the Muslim ban. In January, President Trump issued a ban on 7 Muslim countries from coming to the United States. And obviously, we immediately filed lawsuits, right, because we thought it was unconstitutional and illegal. But at the same time, people were showing up in droves at the airports with signs saying, "You are welcome here. Refugees are welcome here." And at the same time, lawyers not affiliated with the ACLU were trying to find families to protect on an individual basis. And people were making calls, and the media was all over it. And social media has been huge, of course. And we were using WhatsApp. We were talking about WhatsApp before. I was literally using WhatsApp to find, people in transit who had been stuck, who were coming from, Egypt and were stuck in Frankfurt. All of these new tools we're using to harness the power of civil society to further these goals, but in a very deliberate and very cohesive and sort of comprehensive manner. And that's just sort of how we do our work. We do that very deliberately again, and And we think that that's, as we're talking about how nonviolent movements succeed, and the idea of unity, but it's also the idea of working on different levels. That makes the success more likely to succeed in the long term, right? If you have really engaged people on multiple levels, it makes it better when you win because you've got, it's just a sweeter victory than just having, a mayor sign an executive order that doesn't, have the backing of anybody. And so that's just how we do our work, and we've been doing that for many, many years. And I look forward to more discussion.
I thought those were all completely perfect and complementary in interesting ways, but it is a challenge, a little mental exercise to put them together. That's your job. As last night, the end will be at 6 o'clock. You don't get kicked out. I'll probably stand up again and say it's 6 o'clock, but the idea is that you talk at your table for the next 40 minutes about what you've heard.